Hey everybody, this is Tom Mason, and on this part of sculpting the Goblin Baddie, I'm going to show you how to sculpt the large details. The Goblin Menace is up on Kickstarter right now. This set of fun and quirky goblins has been designed to bother, irritate, and annoy adventurers and armies alike. You'll be able to cause all kinds of trouble with these brats. Click the link below and add these guys to your collection. Alright, it's time to get sculpting. Last time on the Mini Sculpting Super Show, we were sculpting the rough details. Now we're going to continue on with which can arguably be called kind of an extension of the rough details, but I like to call this section sculpting the large details because we're not just roughing out main body forms and shapes, we're actually starting to put on detail elements. And before I go any further, I should say that in this tutorial I will be sculpting with Fimo Professional Polyclay. So all this gray material you see me working with is my favorite sculpting medium that won't harden until you set it aside in the oven to bake it and have it firm up. And as you can see here, I've already started to add some of the large details. In this case, it's a belt. Now, this is a little different than before when we were just slapping on big hunks of putty, pushing things into shape. You can do that. There's actually kind of two styles of sculpting details, and there's where you cut in the detail, and then there's where you add on the detail. I do a bit of both. Everybody does a bit of both. Cutting in the detail is a very popular way of sculpting, especially when you're working with putties like Green Stuff and Procreate. But with Fimo, since you have the ability to work things in, blend things in, add and take away a lot easier, this is something that I tend to do a lot more when I'm working with polyclay. This belt is a great example. As you saw, for details like this, I like to spread out thin layer of putty on my thumb, cut it to shape, and then kind of flick it off there, apply it to the figure, and slowly work it into shape. Now, sometimes you'll lose some of that nice, hard, crisp edge, but when you take it from that starting point of putting it either on your thumbnail or even on a piece of paper or something, if in case you have to do a larger element, it gives you the chance to start building up and establishing the form before you get it onto the figure. And it's a lot easier to kind of slice things when it's on a hard surface like that rather than when it's on the figure, even though you can do it. This character will kind of have a loin cloth under the belt, so as I'm working the material of the belt, trying to get it to the right shape and extending it down, I end up having to trim off a bit with the scalpel. But what I do, I don't actually wick it all away. I create the line to make it nice and straight, but I leave the material there and I just kind of fold it down into the lower part of the figure. And what that actually does, I can actually save you some time and effort later of having to build up more clay, especially to create little folds and tucks where that loincloth will be sticking out from under the belt. This stage is all about identifying the areas where you need to add those larger chunks of detail. They're not going to necessarily have a lot of fine detail on them. It's very similar to when we were creating the roughs, but in this case there's going to be a little more form. You have to be a little careful and go a little slower than you would when you're just bulking up that form and finding the overall shape. At this point we have the shape. We just need to start identifying the smaller areas where we have to define those shapes. So that's why we start with things like this large belt. And I'm going to move on now to this hand wrap here on his left arm. Now, if you're paying attention, you might have noticed that I haven't used the Wax 5 once. The only thing I've been using for larger clay movements and manipulations has been the color shaper. But you've been seeing me use that, you've been seeing me use a scalpel, sometimes my X-Acto knife, and then my small burnishing tool. Now, you don't want to use the small burnishing tool a ton because these are larger details, but there are going to be some fine-tuning elements where you might need to have that smaller tool. But generally, you aren't going to need to be using your largest burnishing tool, the Wax 5, very often at this stage. You're going to be having to get a little more fine-tuning going on, especially when you're working on some details like here where I'm cutting in these straps. Now, unlike the wraps you saw me sculpting on his arm, I had put a small piece of putty to kind of start that and create more of a separation between the hand and the wraps. However, on the feet, I didn't feel like I needed that as much. They're going to be a little more covered up, and figured they'd probably be a little tighter. And so I decided to just start cutting them in. Once again, you really need to focus on defining the area that you're going to be adding the detail to. You might put some detail in it, but you need to start by creating that zone so that you understand where you need to be working in, and just start to break up the elements and see how it affects the overall form. Since a major part of the large details for this figure involves sculpting straps, I think I'll talk a minute about that. So what I generally do when I'm sculpting straps is I start by cutting in the basically the top part and the bottom part, the basic shape of where that area will be covered with straps. Then I start to go around with either a scalpel or an X-Acto knife. Kind of depends on the angle I need to cut in with. I usually like to use my scalpel because it's a smaller area, but if I've got a real long cut, the X-Acto knife is a little better. And I start to just draw these different lines. You don't always want to make them perfectly parallel. It's okay to have a couple, but you want to have a few going up into some and down into others to make them look like they're kind of crisscrossing. Once I get all the lines and shapes cut in for the wraps, I start to define the outer edges a little bit, just to give a little more definition between the body part and the wraps themselves. Then I start to and you actually probably saw me just use my Wax 5. I use that and my small burnisher and this other little just rounded tool to start to give I press into the center of the wraps, and that gives them a little bit of a curve out. Makes the edges pop a little bit out as well, and it makes it look like the bandages are getting pulled taut over some skin rather than being this bubbly material just sitting on top. Try not to get frustrated if it just takes a while. There's going to be a lot of back and forth. You're going to push in one area and it might mess up your line. That's okay. Just go back in, cut it, clean it up a little bit, and move on. All right, we're on to the home stretch. This last large detail is going to be the loin cloth area. So I had already built that up a little bit back when I did the rough details, but now I need to start defining that more. And the reason why I went ahead and did that earlier in the rough details and put just a token amount is whenever you're working with poly clay, it tends to be soft as you're working it. It's a little warmer from being on your hands and being manipulated, and when you have to build up larger areas, the whole chunk of clay can start to really push and squish around a lot. So what I'll do is I'll focus on building up the form, and then I'll leave the figure alone and just kind of let it sit to cool off, really, is what's going on. It sounds counterintuitive, but sometimes the best thing you can do with your figure is just set it aside, leave it alone for a minute. Not just for the material, but also just for peace of mind. Give yourself a little bit of a chance to kind of reflect on what you've been doing and how you should approach the next step. I hope you can see how, just as it was important to build up the whole figure, we were continuing that process. Even now that we're getting into details, these are the larger details, and I can't help myself. I'm putting in a few more particular details, but you just need to keep working on the whole. Work on the large areas. Don't get too far deep and into the weeds on the miniature just yet. That part will come, and you'll have so much fun with it when you've just got kind of all the big elements tackled. Then you can just sit back, finish off all the fine details. But that's another video. So until then, keep sculpting.